The world remembers his name, Napoleon, a man who rose from nothing, yet dreamed of everything, a soldier who crowned himself emperor, a conqueror who lost to time, and a mind that bent history itself to his will. But this is not just the story of conquest. It is the story of an idea that ambition, when paired with genius, can reshape the destiny of nations, and that the same fire that creates greatness can destroy it. The year was 1769. France was basking in the fading light of its ancien glory. Across the Mediterranean, the island of Corsica had just fallen under French rule. Among the rocky hills and olive trees, a boy was born, Napoleon Bonaparte, the second son of a minor noble family of Italian descent. From the beginning, he carried two identities: Corsican by blood, French by opportunity. That conflict would never leave him. His father, Carlo, was an ambitious lawyer who quickly embraced French patronage. His mother, Letizia, was fierce, disciplined, and pious, the steel of the family. She would outlive her husband, her son's empire, and even her son himself. Napoleon grew up in a house where money was scarce, but pride was abundant. He learned early that status was fragile, and respect, earned through merit, was worth more than birthright. At the age of 9, he left Corsica to study in France, an islander among mainland aristocrats. He was mocked for his accent, his modest clothes, and his strange Italian-French name. They called him the Little Corsican. But isolation hardened him. He withdrew from the laughter, buried himself in books, history, philosophy, and mathematics. He devoured Plutarch and Caesar, learning that destiny favors the disciplined. By 15, he had mastered the language that once mocked him. By 16, he had become a soldier, a lieutenant of artillery trained in precision and reason. While others sought glory in cavalry and command, Napoleon found it in calculation. He believed war was not chaos, it was geometry. The battlefield is a chessboard, he would later say, and every man is a piece that must be moved with reason. France, at that time, was a nation collapsing under its own contradictions. The monarchy glittered in Versailles, while hunger gnawed at the countryside. The Enlightenment had filled men's heads with ideas of equality and liberty, but kings still believed in divine right. Napoleon entered adulthood as the world around him began to burn. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, and the old order crumbled overnight. For most, it was chaos. For Napoleon, it was opportunity. He saw what others feared: a system breaking, and in its collapse, a new space for power. He joined the Revolutionary Army. He was not yet 20, but already his mind worked like a general's. He studied topography, logistics, morale. Where others charged, he calculated. During the siege of Toulon, 1793, he was still an unknown officer. But his plan to recapture the port from the British changed everything. He mapped every gun, every elevation, every weak point of the enemy line. When his artillery opened fire, the city fell. France had found its prodigy. At 24, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. By 26, he commanded an army. But genius attracts danger as quickly as admiration. When power shifted in Paris, Napoleon was arrested, accused of conspiracy, and nearly executed. In his prison cell, he read The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe and wrote to himself, "A man's worth is measured not by his fortune, but by the direction of his will." He was released days before the guillotine. He had faced death and learned that history spares only the useful. When Paris trembled again in 1795 and royalists marched on the government, Napoleon was given command of the defense. He ordered his cannons to fire grape shot into the crowd. In minutes, the streets were silent, the government was saved, and France would never forget the name Napoleon Bonaparte. The Directory rewarded him with command of the Army of Italy, a ragged, starving, undisciplined force. But he saw in them what others didn't: hunger, both literal and metaphorical. "Soldiers," he told them, "you are naked and starving. The government owes you much. It can give you nothing. But I will lead you to the most fertile plains in the world. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth." They believed him, and he delivered. In a series of campaigns across northern Italy, Napoleon shattered Austrian forces, liberated cities, and captured the imagination of Europe. He moved faster than tradition, struck harder than expectation, and rewrote the language of warfare. He became a hero, but also a myth. And myths, once born, are dangerous to their makers. By the time Napoleon returned from Italy, he was no longer just a general. He was a phenomenon. Across Europe, his victories had shattered empires and rewritten maps. But more dangerous than his armies was his aura, the sense that destiny itself marched behind him. In Paris, crowds gathered to see him, as if he were already a king. He spoke little, smiled rarely, and looked at people as though he saw the shape of their souls. And yet, in his heart, he still felt like an outsider, the Corsican boy who had to prove himself to France, again and again. The Directory, France's unstable government, feared him. The people adored him. And in between the two lay the perfect soil for a revolution inside the revolution. But before destiny would call him to power, Napoleon wanted to confront something larger, civilization itself. He proposed an expedition to Egypt, not just a conquest, but a mission of enlightenment. He wanted to bring the ideals of reason, science, and progress to the cradle of ancient empires. To the French people, it was a grand vision. To Napoleon, it was a chess move, to keep him far from the political chaos of Paris, while he built his legend abroad. In 1798, he set sail with an army of 35,000 men, and 167 scholars, engineers, mathematicians, and artists. It was not just an invasion, it was an empire of ideas. After early victories, his fleet was destroyed by Admiral Nelson at the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon was stranded, cut off from France, and surrounded by an ancient silence. Yet even here, he refused defeat. He studied Islam, debated with his scientists, and founded institutes, observatories, and printing presses. He wanted to conquer ignorance as much as he wanted to conquer land. But Europe would not wait for him. While he was in the desert, France was falling apart. Corruption consumed the Directory, the revolution had devoured its children, and the people longed not for liberty, but for order. Napoleon saw it clearly. France did not need another revolution. It needed a ruler who understood both chaos and control. He returned to Paris in 1799 unannounced, a ghost rising from defeat. Crowds lined the streets again. The soldiers cheered, and within days, he seized the moment history offered. On November 9, 1799, he overthrew the Directory in a coup known as the 18th Brumaire. He walked into the chambers of power like a storm contained in human form. When resistance arose, he stared them down and declared, "I am the revolution." In that moment, the age of ideals ended, and the age of Napoleon began. He established the consulate, with himself as first consul, a title that sounded Roman, yet meant absolute authority. But his rule was not merely tyranny in disguise. Napoleon believed in order through merit. He reformed the laws of France, creating the Civil Code, a system that still forms the basis of modern legal structure across the world. He reorganized education, stabilized the economy, and re-established peace with the church. He turned a revolution's chaos into a functioning state, and as Europe watched, he turned that state into an empire. In 1804, inside the great cathedral of Notre Dame, Pope Pius VII came to crown him emperor, but Napoleon, ever the master of symbolism, took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. The world gasped. For the first time in history, a man had crowned himself emperor, not by divine right, but by the right of his own will. The boy from Corsica, once mocked for his accent, had now bent kings and popes to his ambition. But behind the splendor of the coronation, something else was stirring, a shadow that would soon consume the light. In 1805, Napoleon stood at the height of his power. Europe trembled at the sound of his name. From Lisbon to Warsaw, kings and emperors either bowed to him or fell before his armies. The map of the continent had become a reflection of his mind, geometric, ordered, and absolute. He called it the Grand Empire. But it was more than territory. It was a philosophy, built on merit, reason, and the belief that destiny could be engineered. The crowning moment came at Austerlitz. It was December 2nd, 1805, the anniversary of his coronation. Before dawn, mist covered the hills of Moravia. Across the field stood the combined armies of Austria and Russia, forces twice the size of his own. But Napoleon saw what others could not. He turned fog into strategy, weakness into trap. As the Allies attacked his right flank, he struck at their center, a masterstroke that split their forces in two. By sunset, the battle was over. 40,000 men lay dead or wounded. The sun that rose over Austerlitz would forever be called the Sun of Napoleon. Europe had never seen such genius. But genius is a dangerous mirror. It blinds the one who stares too long. After Austerlitz came Jena, Friedland, and Wagram, each a masterpiece of movement and precision. Each victory fed his legend. And with every triumph, the man who once fought for France began to fight for himself. He crowned his brothers as kings, placed his family on thrones, and ruled Europe as if it were his personal estate. The emperor had become what he once overthrew. His ambition expanded beyond reason, to crush Britain through economic war, to dominate the continent through his continental system. But no blockade could cage a world already changing faster than his will. The more he conquered, the more resistance he faced. Spain rose in rebellion. Prussia smoldered in humiliation. And Russia watched in silence, waiting. Then, in 1812, Napoleon made the most fateful decision of his life, to invade Russia. He told his generals, "We march to teach the Tsar respect, not to destroy Russia." But deep down, he knew he was chasing something else, an illusion of control over the uncontrollable. He crossed the Niemen River in June, leading the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men, drawn from every corner of his empire. The Grande Armée, the greatest force ever assembled. But Russia is not a nation. It is an ocean of land and silence. As Napoleon advanced, the Russians retreated, burning their own cities and fields. The French army followed the smoke deeper and deeper into the void. At Borodino, they finally met. A single day of slaughter that left both sides broken. Napoleon called it a victory. But it was a victory without meaning. When he entered Moscow, he found not triumph, but ashes. The city had been burned by its own people. The empire he sought to conquer simply vanished into flame. Weeks turned into months. Winter descended. The horses died first, then the men. The same roads that led him to glory now became his graveyard. By the time he crossed back into Poland, only a fraction of his army remained. Of 600,000 men, barely 40,000 survived. Europe smelled blood. The legend of invincibility was broken. Kings who once bowed now sharpened their swords. The fire that had built his empire now began to consume it. After 2 decades of war, the world had turned against him. His marshals were exhausted, his allies gone, his empire collapsing. Paris fell. And for the first time in his life, Napoleon was forced to surrender. They exiled him to Elba, a small island off the Italian coast. A cage for a man who once ruled continents. He was given a tiny court, a few soldiers, and the title Emperor of Elba. It was meant to humiliate him. But they misunderstood the man they were trying to contain. On Elba, Napoleon worked like a ruler, not a prisoner. He built roads, schools, and reformed administration. He studied the horizon every day, watching ships pass, and with them the world that had rejected him. Meanwhile, in France, the restored Bourbon monarchy stumbled. The people who had once cheered the return of a king now whispered for the return of the emperor. And Napoleon heard them. In February 1815, he escaped Elba with a handful of loyal men and landed on the southern coast of France. When royal troops came to arrest him, he stepped forward alone, opened his coat and shouted, "If any of you would shoot your emperor, here I am." Not one fired. Instead, they cheered. The army that had abandoned him now carried him back to Paris. The eagle had returned. And for a brief, blazing moment, France belonged to Napoleon once again. It was called the 100 Days, a final act of defiance against fate. Europe united once more to destroy him. At the head of the coalition stood the British Duke of Wellington and the Prussian commander Blücher. On June 18, 1815, in the fields of Waterloo, Napoleon fought his last battle. Rain had turned the ground into mud. Cannon wheels sank. Orders were delayed. And for the first time, fortune refused to listen. The battle raged for 9 hours, lines of infantry clashing, cavalry charges breaking like waves. Napoleon watched as his army, once the pride of Europe, crumbled under the relentless advance of Wellington's troops. When the Prussians arrived from the east, it was over. As darkness fell, Napoleon whispered to his aide, "The thunderbolt has fallen. I have no more command of myself." He fled the field, his uniform stained with mud and rain. The eagle that had soared above Europe was broken. He abdicated once more, this time forever. The victors sent him to Saint Helena, a lonely rock in the South Atlantic, 1,000 miles from the nearest continent. There, under the gaze of his guards, Napoleon began his final battle, not against nations, but against time, memory, and mortality. He dictated his memoirs, rewriting his life as he wanted history to remember it. To some, he was a monster, to others, a savior. To himself, he was both. The man who had dared to hold the world in his hands. Years passed, his health declined. The ocean winds eroded the empire carved in his mind. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, died at the age of 51. His last words were for the people he once ruled, France, the army, Josephine. The man who once commanded millions now lay silent on a distant island, beneath a nameless tomb. But even in death, his shadow stretched across the world. For Napoleon was more than a man, he was a question. How far can ambition carry a human soul before it breaks? Long after his death, the world could not forget him. The waves of Saint Helena may have claimed his body, but his shadow marched on. In France, the people who once cursed his wars now whispered his name like a prayer. Painters painted him, poets invoked him, and the world argued not about what he did, but about what he meant. To some, he was the destroyer of liberty, a tyrant who traded ideals for empire. To others, he was the savior of France, the man who brought order from chaos and merit from privilege. But both were true. For Napoleon Bonaparte was not a man of one face. He was contradiction made flesh, a general and a philosopher, a despot and a dreamer, a man of science who believed in destiny. His civil code reshaped law across Europe and beyond, from Belgium to Brazil, from Italy to Quebec. He standardized education, made merit the path to power, and replaced aristocracy with bureaucracy, a legacy still pulsing through modern states. He showed the world that revolutions do not end with chaos. They end when someone strong enough decides to control it. He showed that ideas can be wielded like weapons, and ambition can outlast even defeat. When his remains were brought back to France in 1840, millions lined the streets of Paris. As his coffin passed beneath the Arc de Triomphe, the crowd cried, "Vive l'Empereur! Long live the Emperor!" But he was already immortal. Napoleon had become an idea, the embodiment of willpower and destiny, a warning and an inspiration at once. "Impossible," he once said, "is a word found only in the dictionary of fools." 2 centuries later, those words still echo, in boardrooms, on battlefields, in every person who dares to defy limitation. Because Napoleon's story is not just about conquest, it is about the cost of greatness. It asks the question every empire, every generation must face. Can ambition build a world without eventually consuming it? And that is why, even after 200 years, the world still stands in the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte. The man who turned his will into an empire and his empire into eternity.